Blood tasted metallic as it slid down my throat and pooled against my tongue. The floor beneath my cheek was cold, polished too clean, the kind of hospital tile that makes every sound echo longer than it should. Somewhere above me, a woman gasped. Someone else whispered my name, or maybe they didn't. My ears were ringing too loudly to tell. He stood over me with the papers still shaking in his hand. "Choose how you pay, my stepbrother," said his voice bouncing off the walls of the gynecologist's waiting room. "Or get out." 3 days earlier, a surgeon had stitched me back together after my body failed to hold on to a pregnancy. I wanted more than anything I'd ever admitted out loud. I was still moving slowly, still guarding my ribs, still counting breaths so the pain wouldn't spike. And now I was on the floor staring at the scuffed toe of my own shoe, while strangers backed away from us like they were watching something contagious unfold. "I'm not signing," I said. My voice didn't rise. It barely carried. The slap came fast and hard, a flat crack that snapped my head sideways and sent my shoulder into the tile. Pain exploded through my ribs, white and blinding, as if the stitches were tearing open one by one. I tasted copper again. Someone screamed. A nurse shouted for security. Another voice said they were calling the police. My stepbrother leaned closer, his mouth twisting into a sneer I recognized from childhood. "You think you're too good for it," he said. "Now you get nothing." As I lay there struggling to breathe, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about money. It never had been. This was about erasing me completely. The security guards arrived first, their shoes squeaking as they moved between us. One of them helped me sit up, careful and apologetic like I was already something fragile. A nurse pressed gauze to my mouth and kept asking me questions I could barely answer. My stepbrother took a step back, smoothing his jacket, lowering his voice as if he hadn't just knocked me to the floor. "It's a family disagreement," he said calmly. "She's under a lot of stress." I watched him switch faces, watched how easily the anger vanished. The police arrived a few minutes later, and the waiting room turned into a blur of uniforms, clipboards, and murmured statements. I could feel eyes on me from every corner, strangers studying the bruises blooming along my cheekbone, the way I was hunched forward to protect my ribs. A doctor crouched beside me and explained gently that the impact could have caused internal bleeding. She asked if I felt dizzy. She asked if I could stand. I nodded, even though everything in me wanted to stay on the floor, where I didn't have to pretend to be strong. My stepbrother caught my eye as they led him toward the doors. He didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed, like this had been an inconvenience, not a mistake. As he passed, he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You had your chance," he said. By the time I left the hospital, it was dark. A friend drove me because my hands were still shaking too badly to hold the steering wheel. The city lights blurred past the window, and every time we stopped at a red light, I saw his face again, heard the echo of his voice in that room. He had come prepared. He had known where I would be, and he had been absolutely certain I had no right to say no. When we pulled into the driveway of my father's house, I felt a flicker of relief I didn't trust. The porch light was on, glowing warm against the night. For a moment, it looked the way it always had, solid and familiar, like it had when I was a teenager, sneaking in past curfew, or when my father stood in the doorway waving me inside during summer storms. The front door opened before I could reach it. My stepmother stood there, hands folded, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled concern. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "We heard about the hospital. Are you all right?" Behind her, my stepbrother leaned against the hallway wall, arms crossed, already home. Already comfortable. "I'm fine," I said. It was a lie, but it was the kind people expected. Inside the house smelled different, cleaner, sharper. My father's favorite chair had been moved. The stack of mail on the counter was gone. When I glanced toward his office, the door was shut, and for the first time in my life, locked. "We need to talk," my stepbrother said, pushing off the wall. His voice was polite now, almost bored. He set the papers down on the kitchen table, spreading them out like a dealer laying cards. The same papers he'd waved in my face earlier, Edge's crisp signatures already in place where mine was supposed to go. "This will make things easier," he said, "for everyone." I didn't touch them. "I want to see Dad's will." My stepmother sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "Sweetheart, this is what your father wanted. He didn't want things dragged out." That was the first crack. My father never rushed anything. He measured twice, sometimes 3 times, and he hated pressure of any kind. He used to tell me that anyone who wanted you to sign fast was hiding something. "I'm not signing anything tonight," I said. My stepbrother's jaw tightened just slightly. "You don't have a lot of leverage here." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to wait," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled. "We'll talk tomorrow." I went to my room and closed the door, leaning against it, while my heart pounded. The house felt occupied in a way it hadn't that morning, like I was a guest instead of a daughter. I noticed my dresser drawers had been rearranged. My laptop was exactly where I'd left it, but the charging cable was gone. I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me tense, every footstep in the hallway tightening something in my chest. By morning, it was clear this wasn't a conversation. It was a removal. My stepbrother handed me a printed notice over breakfast, his tone casual, like he was passing the salt. It referenced clauses I'd never heard of and gave me until the end of the day to vacate the property. "This is temporary," my stepmother added quickly, not meeting my eyes. "No," he corrected. "It's effective immediately." I packed under their watch, allowed to take only what they decided counted as essential. When my belongings were carried outside and dropped onto the lawn, the humiliation burned hotter than the slap had. A framed photo of my parents cracked when it hit the concrete. A necklace my father had given my mother tangled in the wet grass. A neighbor watched from across the street, then looked away. That was when an older woman pulled into the driveway, her car rattling softly as it came to a stop. She took in the scene in silence, her eyes sharp and assessing. "This isn't right," she said finally. My stepbrother stiffened. "This is a family matter." She looked at him unimpressed. "Not anymore. I left with her an hour later, my life reduced to boxes in the back seat. As we drove away, I watched my stepbrother lock the front door. He didn't look back. That night, lying on her couch with an ice pack against my ribs, I replayed everything. The hospital, the papers, the certainty in his voice, the speed with which he'd pushed me out. They thought fear would make me disappear. They thought pain would make me compliant. They were wrong. For the first time since the cold tile pressed against my cheek, I stopped trying to survive the moment and started paying attention to what they were so desperate to hide. I left the hospital after midnight, my mouth stitched my ribs, wrapped my head pounding in a way painkillers couldn't touch. The city looked the same as it always had. Streetlights blinking on and off cars, hissing past on wet pavement, but I felt like I'd been dropped back into it without skin. Every sound landed too sharply. Every shadow felt intentional. My friend Lena drove because I couldn't keep my hand steady on the wheel. She didn't ask questions. She just kept glancing over at me like she was afraid I might shatter if she said the wrong thing. The silence between us grew thick, broken only by the rhythmic click of the turn signal and the low hum of the engine. I kept hearing his voice. "Choose how you pay or get out." It wasn't what he said that haunted me. It was how sure he'd been, not angry, not desperate, certain. Like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed long before I ever stepped into that waiting room. When we pulled into my father's driveway, I felt something twist in my chest. The house sat there exactly as it always had, lights glowing softly through the curtains, porch clean and swept. From the outside, it still looked like a place where nothing bad could happen, like a place that belonged to me. Lena parked and turned off the engine. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," I said, even though I wasn't. I didn't want witnesses. Not yet. The front door was unlocked, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air smelled different, not like my father's aftershave or the faint trace of coffee that always lingered in the kitchen, but something sharper, more deliberate. Lemon cleaner, new detergent, erasure. The living room lamp was on, even though I'd turned it off that morning. A pair of unfamiliar shoes sat neatly by the door. I stood there for a long moment listening. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low, controlled. They stopped the instant I moved. My stepmother appeared first, her expression already arranged into concern. "Donna, sweetheart." "We were so worried," she said, stepping forward as if to hug me, then stopping when she saw the way I flinched. "I'm tired," I said. Behind her, my stepbrother leaned against the counter, arms crossed perfectly at ease. He looked at my face, at the swelling along my cheek, and his mouth twitched. Not remorse, calculation. "You should be resting," he said. "The doctor said that, right?" I nodded, even though he hadn't been there, even though he had no business knowing what any doctor had said to me. "I'm going to bed," I said. "Of course," my stepmother replied. "We'll talk in the morning." As I turned toward the hallway, I noticed the door to my father's office was closed, locked. It had never been locked before. He used to joke that there was nothing in there worth stealing, just paperwork and memories. I slept badly. Every sound jolted me awake. Footsteps, a door opening, a whispered conversation I couldn't quite hear. When morning finally came, my head throbbed and my ribs felt like they were packed with broken glass. Downstairs, the kitchen was already in motion. Coffee brewed, dishes clinked. My stepmother hummed softly, a habit she'd picked up after marrying my father, as if she thought it made her sound gentle. My stepbrother slid a mug toward me without asking how I took it. "We need to go over a few things today," he said. I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "I'm not discussing anything until I've spoken to a lawyer." He didn't react. That scared me more than anger would have. "There's no need to make this harder than it already is. I want to see Dad's will," I said again. My stepmother sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "Donna, please. Your father was very clear. He wanted things handled quickly. He didn't want conflict." That was when I knew they were lying. My father hated being rushed. He used to say that speed was how people got sloppy, and sloppy was how they lost everything. After his first heart scare, he'd gone over his affairs again and again, checking details, updating lists, explaining his decisions to me over long Sunday breakfasts. "This doesn't sound like him," I said. My stepbrother's eyes hardened. "You weren't involved in everything." The words landed exactly where he intended them to. "You weren't involved. You didn't matter. You don't belong here." After breakfast, I tried to gather myself to think clearly, but the house no longer felt like a place where thinking was safe. Drawers had been reorganized. My mail sat in a neat pile by itself, separated from theirs. The calendar on the fridge had been wiped clean, replaced with a new one that didn't include my name. I went to my father's office again and tried the handle. Locked. When I turned back, my stepbrother was standing at the end of the hall watching me. "That room's off limits for now," he said. "For now," I repeated. "Yes," he said calmly, "until everything's settled." The papers appeared again that afternoon, laid out on the kitchen table like a final offering. This time they were organized, tabbed, intimidating in their neatness. "This is generous," my stepmother said, "given everything." I didn't sit down. "I'm not signing anything without legal review." My stepbrother didn't raise his voice. That wasn't one of the options. I stared at him. "You can't just decide that." He smiled thinly. "We already have." The words settled over me like dust. Not a threat, a statement of fact. "You don't live here anymore," he said as casually as if he were telling me the weather. My stepmother didn't contradict him. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together the picture of reluctant agreement. For a moment, everything inside me went quiet. I saw it clearly, then the shape of what they were doing. This wasn't about fairness or grief or honoring my father. This was about speed, about control, about removing the one variable they couldn't predict. Later, while I stood alone in my room trying to decide what to pack, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Caldwell from next door stood in the hallway, glancing nervously toward the stairs. "I didn't want to say anything at the funeral," she whispered, "but your father came by a few days before he passed. He seemed upset, asked to use my phone, said he didn't trust his own." My stomach dropped. That night, as I lay awake, listening to the house settle around me, I realized the slap in the hospital hadn't been the beginning. It had been a mistake, a crack in a plan that had already been moving for weeks, maybe months. They hadn't just decided to push me out. They'd been preparing for my absence long before I ever knew I needed to fight back. The morning after they decided I no longer belonged in my own home, I woke to the sound of footsteps stopping just outside my door. I lay still, counting my breaths, listening as someone shifted their weight in the hallway. After a moment, the steps moved away. The house settled into a false quiet, the kind that felt staged like a set waiting for actors to return. My ribs screamed when I sat up. The bruising along my cheek had darkened overnight, a deep purple blooming under my eye. I stared at my reflection for a long moment, trying to recognize myself. I looked smaller somehow, folded inward, like someone who'd been told too many times to stay out of the way. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toast. My stepmother stood at the counter, back straight, movements efficient. She glanced up when I entered and offered a tight smile. "Good morning, honey. You should have slept in." "I didn't," I said. My stepbrother sat at the table with his laptop open, already dressed, already working. He didn't look up right away. He let the silence stretch, then finally met my eyes. "We should talk," he said. I poured myself coffee without asking. The mug I reached for wasn't mine. Mine had been moved to the back of the cabinet. It was a small thing, almost laughable, but it made something in my chest tighten. "What's left to say?" I asked. He closed the laptop slowly. "We need to be clear about expectations." My stepmother placed a plate of toast in front of him and rested her hand on the back of his chair just for a second. It was subtle. Support disguised as neutrality. "We're trying to make this as smooth as possible," she said. "Given everything you've been through." There it was, the hospital, the miscarriage. My grief repackaged as a weakness they could lean on. "I'm still not signing anything," I said. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "That's your choice." Relief flickered in me for half a second before he added, "But choices have consequences." I finished my coffee and stood. "I'm going back to my room." "Actually," he said, pushing his chair back, "it might be better if you start packing." The words were calm, casual, as if he were suggesting I reorganize a closet. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He didn't argue. He walked past me instead down the hallway and stopped in front of my door. When he opened it, the lock clicked loudly, deliberately. "You don't live here anymore," he said. "We went over this." "No, you decided it," I said. "There's a difference." He turned to face me, blocking the doorway. "Not legally." The documents appeared an hour later, set on the dining room table this time, as if a change of scenery might soften the blow. They were thicker than before, bound neatly highlighted and tabbed. "This is the final version," my stepmother said. "We've simplified things." "I want to see Dad's original will," I said. My stepbrother tapped the stack with one finger. "This is it." "No," I said. "This is what you want me to believe, is it?" His eyes flashed just for a moment before he smoothed his expression. "You're being emotional." "That's funny," I said. "You seemed pretty emotional at the hospital." My stepmother stepped in quickly. "Let's not rehash that. Everyone was under stress." "I was recovering from surgery," I said. "He hit me." "That was a misunderstanding," she replied softly. "You startled him." I laughed. Then a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. "I startled him by saying no." Silence fell over the room. My stepbrother slid one of the documents toward me. "You can sign today and walk away with a clean break, or you can drag this out and make it harder for everyone." "For everyone," I repeated. "Or just for me." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't have leverage here. The house, the accounts, the company, none of it is yours." I looked down at the papers and noticed something I hadn't before. A line buried deep in the text referencing termination of residency, effective immediately. "You've already decided," I said quietly. "Yes," he said. "That's how this works." I pushed the papers back toward him. "Then I won't be signing." His jaw tightened. "Fine, fine." The words sounded too easy, too rehearsed. I went back to my room and began packing under supervision. My stepmother hovered in the doorway, offering to help in a voice that made my skin crawl. "Just take what you need for now," she said. "We can sort out the rest later." Later. Another word that meant nothing. As I folded clothes into a suitcase, I noticed things missing. A folder from my desk, a small lockbox I kept old letters in. When I asked about them, my stepbrother appeared instantly. "We're inventorying," he said, "for the estate." "You're stealing," I said. He smiled thinly. "That's a strong accusation." By early afternoon, my belongings were stacked near the front door. Not packed, stacked, like items waiting to be moved out of the way. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw my things scattered across the lawn instead, exposed to the open sky. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain in my ribs. Neighbors glanced over, curiosity battling discomfort. No one intervened. I couldn't blame them. This looked like a family matter, a private implosion. People don't like to step into those. As I stood there, stunned, Mrs. Caldwell from next door approached slowly, her face pinched with concern. "Donna?" she whispered, glancing back toward the house. "I didn't want to cause trouble, but your father, he seemed worried near the end. He asked to use my phone once, said someone was listening." My heart stuttered. Before I could ask more, my stepbrother's voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem?" Mrs. Caldwell straightened. I was just checking on her. "We've got it handled," he said. She hesitated, then leaned closer to me. "Be careful what you sign," she murmured. That was when something inside me shifted. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I finished gathering what I could and waited at the curb, my life condensed into a few battered suitcases. When a car pulled up, I didn't recognize it at first. Then the door opened and an older woman stepped out, her gaze sharp and assessing. She took in the lawn, the boxes, my face, and then she looked at my stepbrother. "This isn't right," she said flatly. He bristled. "This is a family issue." "Not anymore," she replied. I left with her an hour later. As we drove away, I watched my stepbrother lock the door behind us. He didn't look back. That night, lying awake on her couch, I replayed the day in my mind. The documents, the certainty, the speed. They hadn't reacted to me. They'd executed a plan. They weren't asking me to leave. They were already practicing what life looked like without me. The notice came the next morning, printed on thick paper and slipped through the mail slot with a sound that echoed through the house like a verdict. I picked it up off the floor slowly, my ribs protesting with every breath. The language was cold and formal, full of clauses and deadlines that made my head spin. It informed me that my residency had been terminated effective immediately. Effective immediately. No warning, no appeal, no acknowledgement that I'd been sleeping under that roof for years, that my father had built that house with his own hands and insisted I always have a room there. My stepmother stood behind me as I read, her arms folded loosely, her face carefully composed. "It's just a formality," she said. "We didn't want things to get complicated." My stepbrother stepped past her and pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. "You've got until tonight." "Tonight," I repeated. "Yes," he said. "That gives you time to pack." I looked at him, then really looked. He wasn't angry, he wasn't rushed. He was calm in a way that made my stomach twist. This had been written long before the hospital. Long before the slap. This wasn't retaliation, it was execution. They watched me pack, not openly, not with crossed arms and scowls, but with the quiet vigilance of people making sure nothing slipped past them. My stepmother hovered near the doorway, offering to hold boxes, asking if I needed tape. My stepbrother drifted in and out, pretending to take phone calls, while his eyes tracked every movement I made. Just the essentials, he reminded me. "We'll inventory the rest later." Later had become his favorite word. It meant never. As I moved through the room, I noticed the gaps. The drawer where I kept my father's old watch was empty. The folder of paperwork I'd been organizing after his death was gone. When I asked about it, my stepbrother appeared instantly, like he'd been waiting. "We secured anything important," he said. "For the estate." "For the estate," I echoed. "Yes," he replied. "You don't want things getting lost." I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded and kept packing. Arguing only fed him. I could see that now. By early afternoon, my belongings had been carried out the front door and dropped onto the lawn. Not placed, dropped, boxes tipped on their sides, clothes spilling out where the lids hadn't been taped properly. A framed photo of my parents cracked when it hit the concrete, the glass spiderwebbing across my mother's smile. The sky had darkened while I was upstairs. A cold wind picked up scattering loose papers across the grass. The neighborhood was quiet in that peculiar midweek way, curtains drawn, televisions murmuring behind walls. I could feel eyes on me even when I couldn't see faces. My stepmother stood on the porch, wringing her hands. "This doesn't have to be so dramatic," she said. "We're not throwing you out. You're choosing to make this difficult." I stared at the mess of my life at my feet. "You changed the locks," I said. "That's temporary," she replied quickly. My stepbrother didn't bother with excuses. He leaned against the doorframe and watched me in silence, his gaze flicking from my bruised face to the boxes on the lawn. That was when a car pulled into the driveway, its engine rattling softly as it came to a stop. An older woman stepped out, her movements deliberate, her posture straight. She took in the scene without speaking, her eyes sharp and assessing. "This isn't right," she said finally. My stepbrother stiffened. "This is a family matter." She looked at him the way people look at something they've already measured and dismissed. Not anymore. Her name was Margot. She'd been a friend of my father's for years, though I'd only met her a handful of times at holidays. She didn't rush to hug me or ask if I was okay. She knelt instead and picked up the cracked frame, studying it like evidence. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked me. I shook my head. "Then you're coming with me," she said, standing. "Now!" My stepbrother opened his mouth to object, then seemed to think better of it. Margot met his gaze without blinking. "I'll be in touch," she said. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. As we loaded what we could into her car, the first drops of rain began to fall, darkening the grass, soaking the cardboard. I watched my stepbrother lock the front door behind us, the click of the deadbolt loud and final. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Margot's house was small and cluttered in a comforting way, shelves lined with books and framed photographs, the air smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. She set me up on the couch with an ice pack and a glass of water, then disappeared into the kitchen. "You're safe here," she said, returning with a blanket. "But safe doesn't mean done." That night I didn't sleep. Every sound outside made my heart race. Around 3 a.m, a sharp crash shattered the quiet. Glass. The unmistakable sound of something hitting metal. Margot was on her feet, instantly phone in hand. She ushered me into the back bedroom and locked the door behind us. "Stay quiet," she whispered. We waited, listening to footsteps crunch on gravel, a car door slam, an engine roar to life. By the time the police arrived, whoever it was had gone. They took statements, shined flashlights across the yard, shook their heads apologetically. When they left, Margot walked me to the garage. A message had been spray-painted across the door in uneven letters. "Stop digging." My stomach dropped. "They want you scared," Margot said calmly. "That means they're nervous." The next morning, my stepbrother showed up at her door, his concern as polished as everything else about him. "I heard there was some trouble," he said, glancing past her shoulder into the house. "This neighborhood isn't very safe." Margot smiled, a thin, dangerous curve of her lips. "Neither is yours," she said. "Now get off my property." He left without another word. After he was gone, Margot pulled out her laptop and set it on the kitchen table. "Your father trusted me," she said, "which means I'm going to trust him now. And you." She explained in careful, measured terms what she thought was happening, how speed and isolation were classic tactics, how intimidation followed discovery, how paperwork could be weaponized. "They're not just trying to push you out," she said. "They're trying to buy time." That night, as I lay awake under her roof, the fear finally gave way to something else. Anger sharp and focused. They thought pushing me out would make me quiet. They thought losing the house would break me. Instead, it stripped away the last illusion I'd been clinging to. They hadn't taken everything from me. They'd given me a reason to stop being polite. I woke up on Margot's couch just before dawn, the house still and dim, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. For the first time in days, my body hurt in a way that felt manageable. My ribs still ached, my jaw still throbbed. But the panic that had been living just under my skin had loosened its grip. Margot was already awake. I could hear her in the kitchen moving with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating. The smell of coffee drifted through the room, rich and grounding. "Morning," she said, when she noticed my eyes were open. "Sit tight. Don't move fast." I followed instructions. That seemed to be a theme lately. But this time it felt different. Less like submission, more like strategy. She set a mug on the table in front of me and watched as I wrapped my hands around it. "Today," she said, "we figure out what they rushed." "What do you mean?" I asked. Margot pulled up a chair and sat across from me, her expression sharp, focused. "People who are acting honestly don't need speed. People who are hiding something do." She asked me to tell her everything again. Not how it felt, not what I thought it meant, just what happened. In order, dates, words, exact phrases. At first I stumbled. Trauma blurs details. But as I spoke, something strange happened. Patterns started to appear. The hospital confrontation, the papers waiting at the house, the notice already printed. The locks changed overnight. They never adjusted, Margot said quietly. They executed. She stopped me when I repeated one of my stepbrother's lines. Effective immediately, she said. That language matters. It's meant to scare you into thinking you're already too late. I felt that I admitted. Like the ground had already disappeared. That's the point. She leaned back and studied me. Did they ever show you the original documents? Not summaries, not explanations. Originals. No, I said. They just kept telling me this was it. Margot nodded once. Of course they did. After breakfast, she told me to bring her what little I'd managed to save. I returned with my bag and set it on the table, embarrassed by how small it looked. She didn't comment. She simply watched as I unpacked. Clothes, toiletries, a cracked photo frame. And then, at the bottom wrapped in an old scarf, something I hadn't thought about since I grabbed it in a daze. A slim, leather-bound notebook. Margot's eyes flicked to it immediately. That she said looks deliberate. I picked it up, my fingers suddenly unsteady. My dad gave it to me a few months ago, I said. He told me to keep it somewhere safe. I thought it was just notes. He was always writing things down. Did you read it? She asked. I shook my head. Not really. I didn't want to pry. Margot didn't smile. Sometimes not prying is the problem. I opened the notebook slowly. Inside were my father's neat, careful entries. Dates, names, numbers, short observations written in the same tidy script he used for grocery lists and construction estimates. At first it looked boring, mundane, but then I started noticing things that didn't fit. A payment marked twice, a contractor's name crossed out and rewritten, a question mark in the margin next to a familiar account number. Margot leaned over my shoulder. There, she said, tapping the page. That hesitation. That's not his style. No, I said. He hated uncertainty, which means she said when he wrote that something had already gone wrong. We spent the rest of the morning reading together, not rushing, letting the details surface on their own. I felt something shift inside me as we worked. A part of me my stepbrother had always dismissed, always joked about. He used to roll his eyes when I talked about contracts, about systems, about how things flowed behind the scenes. You worry too much, he'd say. You're not built for this stuff. I believed him for a long time, but sitting there with Margot tracing my father's careful handwriting, I realized something uncomfortable and powerful. Being overlooked had protected me. Margot finally closed the notebook and met my eyes. This explains why they panicked. I swallowed. You think my dad knew. I think, she said carefully, he suspected, and I think he trusted you more than he trusted them. The words hit harder than anything my stepbrother had done. My father, methodical to the end, had been preparing without alarming me. Without tipping his hand, I thought of all the times he'd reminded me to read everything, to never sign under pressure, to walk away if someone tried to hurry me. That afternoon, Margot laid out her theory. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, a framework. Your stepbrother's urgency, she said, suggests exposure. The eviction wasn't about reclaiming space. It was about control. And the hospital incident, that wasn't negotiation. That was intimidation. My stomach tightened. So what do? We verify, she said, quietly. We don't confront. We don't accuse. Not yet. I wanted to argue. I wanted to storm back into that house and demand answers. But something in her tone stopped me. She wasn't afraid. She was patient. People rush when the clock is already ticking, she said. Let them. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened the notebook again. I traced one of the entries I hadn't noticed before. A date that didn't align with anything my stepbrother had claimed. An amount that didn't match the story I'd been told. It was small, almost invisible, but it was wrong. For the first time since the hospital floor pressed cold against my cheek, I felt something solid beneath me. Not safety, not certainty, direction. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they'd measured me correctly. They never bothered to look at what my father had quietly placed in my hands. And now I knew exactly where to start. The feeling started before anything actually happened. It crept in quietly the way a headache does when you don't notice it until it's already there. A sense that the air around me had changed, that the quiet Margot's house offered was being watched, measured, noted. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. Trauma does that, everyone says. It sharpens your senses until everything feels like a threat. But even Margot noticed the way I kept pausing mid-sentence listening. "You're not paranoid," she said one afternoon as we sat at the kitchen table, papers spread between us. "You're alert. There's a difference." The first sign was small enough to dismiss if I wanted to. A dark sedan parked across the street one morning, engine idling, windows tinted. It was gone by the time I looked again. Later that day, my phone glitched while I was making a call, the line dropping for no reason. Once is nothing, twice is coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. We went out the next morning to verify one detail from my father's notebook. Nothing dramatic, just a public records office across town. Bright lights, chipped linoleum, the kind of place where nothing feels secret. Margot stayed a few steps behind me as I spoke to the clerk. I slid the request form across the counter and waited heart-steady, face neutral. The clerk frowned at her screen. "That date doesn't line up," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied. "That's what I was told." "Well," she said slowly, "that transaction didn't happen when you think it did." She printed a page and handed it to me. Margot glanced over my shoulder, her expression unreadable. We thanked the clerk and walked out without saying a word. Outside, Margot didn't speak until we reached the car. That, she said calmly, is your first confirmed lie. I felt a strange rush then. Not joy, not triumph, clarity. The kind that sharpens instead of overwhelms. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed the sedan again. Same dark color, same tinted windows. It followed at a distance, never close enough to be obvious, never far enough to lose. Margot changed lanes without signaling. The car stayed with us. She turned down a side street. So did the sedan. "Don't look back," she said. "Just breathe." My hands trembled in my lap, but I forced myself to stay still. After a few blocks, the car slowed, then turned off abruptly. Margot memorized the plate number out loud. "They want you unsettled," she said. "That's how they slow you down." That afternoon, my stepbrother called. I stared at my phone as it rang, my pulse spiking. Margot watched me closely. "Answer," she said, "but don't offer anything." I picked up. "Hello?" His voice was smooth, almost warm. "I heard you had a rough night," he said. "I just wanted to check on you." My stomach twisted. "I'm fine. You've been through a lot," he continued. "Health issues, stress. It's not good for you to be worrying about things you don't need to handle." I said nothing. "There are people who care about you," he went on, "who want to see you move on, start fresh." "How did you know where I was?" I asked quietly. A pause. Just a fraction of a second. "Margot mentioned you were staying with her." My grip tightened on the phone. Margot hadn't spoken to him. I knew that. She knew that. "Listen," he said, his tone softening. "Dragging this out isn't going to end the way you think it will. For your own good, you should let this go." "For my own good," I repeated. "Yes," he said. "I'd hate to see you hurt yourself more than you already have." When the call ended, Margot exhaled slowly. "That wasn't concern," she said. "That was a warning. The messages didn't stop there. A neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars near Margot's house and asked if everything was okay. A former colleague of mine reached out, oddly curious about whether I'd moved recently. An anonymous number called twice and disconnected as soon as I answered. None of it was overt. That was the point. They're creating noise, Margot explained, trying to make you doubt what you know. That evening, I stepped outside alone for the first time since leaving my father's house. I just wanted air, space. The sky was darkening, the street quiet. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the faint sound of an engine starting somewhere down the block. When I went back inside, Margot was waiting by the door. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She handed me a notebook and a pen. "Write it all down," she said. "Dates, times, words, even if it feels stupid." Why, I asked. "Because intimidation only works in the dark," she replied. We're not giving them darkness. That night, something appeared on Margot's front porch. It wasn't dramatic. No broken windows, no shouting, just a small, deliberate act. A single glove laid neatly on the doormat. Not ours. Clean. Intentional. I stared at it, my skin prickling. "They want you to notice," Margot said calmly. "And you did." Fear surged sharp and immediate. For a moment, I wanted to run, to hide, to disappear the way they clearly expected me to. Margot placed a hand on my shoulder. "This means you're close," she said. "They wouldn't waste energy otherwise." I sat at the kitchen table later, staring at my father's notebook. My own notes spread beside it. My fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer paralyzing. If they wanted me scared enough to stop, they should have stayed quiet. Every move they made only confirmed what Margot and I already suspected. They weren't confident. They were exposed. And now I wasn't going to look away. We couldn't wait anymore. The glove on Margot's porch stayed in my mind like a blinking warning light. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even threatening on its own. But it was deliberate, and deliberation takes effort. People don't waste effort unless they're protecting something. Margot set her coffee down that morning and looked at me over the rim of her mug. "They're paying attention now," she said, "which means whatever they thought was hidden isn't." I nodded. My ribs still ached when I moved too quickly, but the pain had stopped dictating my thoughts. Fear had burned off into something colder and more useful. "We widen the lens," she said, carefully. "Everything we touch stays clean." Margot still had access to records from her professional life. Not passwords she wasn't entitled to, not shortcuts that could blow back on us. Legitimate doors that hadn't been closed yet because no one expected her to use them again. People like my stepbrother underestimated her the same way they underestimated me. We started with my father's company. Not the obvious accounts, not the headline numbers. Margot taught me to look for repetition instead, names that appeared too often, amounts that stayed just below thresholds that triggered reviews, transactions spaced out with just enough time between them to look routine. At first, it felt like staring at static. Then shapes emerged. "That name again," I said, pointing to a line item I'd seen 3 times already. Margot leaned closer. And there. It wasn't family. It wasn't a vendor I recognized. It was a small consulting firm with a bland name and a mailing address 2 states away. "People like this don't work for free," Margot said quietly. As we dug deeper, the pattern sharpened. Small withdrawals, clean paperwork. Justifications that sounded reasonable unless you read them side by side. Over time, the amounts added up to something that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't sloppy. It was systematic. "Your stepbrother didn't design this," Margot said. "He's executing it." The realization landed heavier than I expected. A part of me had wanted him to be the mastermind, something simple, something personal. But this was bigger than his temper and entitlement. This was a machine, and he was one of its moving parts. We verified one date he'd insisted on, the one he'd repeated like a mantra when he tried to rush me. The official record contradicted him outright. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. So he lied. Margot nodded. "And that's the first one we can prove." Proof felt different than suspicion. It grounded me, made everything else snap into focus. His urgency, the eviction, the hospital confrontation. All of it pointed to one thing: time. They needed it. And I had taken it away by refusing to disappear quietly. As the afternoon wore on, we mapped the flow of money across months, then years. The consulting firm connected to other entities, shells nested inside shells. Each layer insulated the next. Margot showed me how to stop looking at individual documents and start looking at behavior. "Fraud doesn't scream," she said. "It whispers consistently." That was when I noticed something she almost missed. "Wait," I said, scrolling back. "That adjustment doesn't match the rest." Margot paused. "Why not?" "Because my dad wouldn't approve this without a corresponding change here," I said, tapping another column. "He hated asymmetry. He used to say numbers should balance the way buildings do." She studied it, then looked at me with something like pride. That's the piece they missed. It wasn't a smoking gun. Not yet. But it tied the manipulation directly to my father's habits, to the way he thought and worked. It showed that whoever altered these records didn't fully understand him, which meant they hadn't expected me. By evening, we had a working theory, not an accusation, a shape. My stepbrother had been draining value quietly, hiding behind layers of plausible transactions. Someone else had designed the system, someone who knew how to keep it invisible. And when my father started noticing irregularities, the response wasn't transparency, it was removal. "They didn't exile you because you were weak," Margot said, as we stood back from the table, papers spread like a battlefield. "They exiled you because you were in the way." I felt that truth settle deep in my chest, not as fear, as validation. We talked options then. Confrontation, authorities, silence. Each had a cost, each had risks. If you go too early, Margot warned, they'll scatter. Evidence evaporates, stories align. "And if we wait," I asked. "They get sloppy," she said. "People who think they're winning always do." I thought about my stepbrother's face when he smiled at me, the way he enjoyed explaining things, correcting me, asserting control. His ego was a weakness he didn't recognize as one. "I don't want to accuse him yet," I said. "I want him to talk." Margot considered that, then nodded slowly. "Then you let him think he's already won." That night, as I lay in the guest room, I replayed everything we'd found. The numbers, the names, the patterns. My fear had shifted again, tightening into focus. This wasn't just about my inheritance, or the house, or even my father's company. It was about betrayal dressed up as efficiency, about people who believed they could rewrite reality if they moved fast enough. I realized something else then, something that surprised me with its calm. They had tried to erase me, to push me out so thoroughly that no one would question my absence. But in doing so, they had given me distance, space to see clearly, to stop reacting and start observing. By the time morning came, my resolve felt solid, not angry, not rushed, precise. They thought I was gone, that I'd been reduced to boxes on a lawn and a couch in someone else's house. They thought the story was closing. They were wrong. This was the point where it finally made sense why they'd been so desperate to get me out of the way. Because if I stayed, if I watched, if I followed the paper trail, they'd overlooked everything. They were hiding would come into the light, and they knew it. I told Margot I was ready to call him before she had a chance to suggest it herself. She looked at me for a long moment, weighing something behind her eyes. "Once you do this," she said carefully, "you don't get to pull it back. He will smell blood." "That's the point," I said. "He only relaxes when he thinks I'm finished." We sat at the kitchen table and planned the collapse, not the real one, the performance. Margot coached me the way you might coach someone learning a foreign language. Tone mattered more than words. Pace mattered more than content. I couldn't sound angry. I couldn't sound clever. I had to sound tired, confused, smaller than I actually felt. Never accuse, she reminded me. Never explain. Let him fill the silence. I practiced until my throat hurt. Saying his name out loud felt wrong now, like summoning something I'd already locked away. But eventually I picked up the phone. It rang twice. "Hello," he answered, his voice alert, already prepared. "It's me," I said softly. I let my voice shake just enough to be believable. I'm sorry to call like this." There was a pause, then a sigh perfectly calibrated. "Donna? I was wondering when you'd come around." The words stung, even though I'd expected them. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy to fight." I heard the shift instantly. A subtle loosening. Satisfaction sliding into his tone. "I told you this would be easier if you stopped pushing," he said. "You've had a rough time. No one blames you. No one. Except him." "I just want it to be over," I whispered. "I don't want to be homeless. I don't want to keep asking people for help." He hummed thoughtfully. "Well, that depends on what I asked. On whether you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. His favorite word. The one he used whenever he meant obedient. "I am," I said quickly. Too quickly. Margot had warned me he'd notice eagerness. But eagerness was part of the mask. He chuckled. Good. Then let's talk terms. He laid them out like he was doing me a favor. A lump sum, a clean break, papers signed and filed so I could move on with my life. He even increased the amount slightly, just enough to make it sound generous. This offer won't last, he added. I've already stretched farther than I need to. I swallowed hard. I understand. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the phone, my hands trembling for real this time. Margot watched me carefully. He took it, she said. Too easily, I replied. That's greed, she said. It makes people sloppy. Over the next day, I leaned into the role. I missed a call on purpose. When I returned it, I apologized too much. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, questions designed to make him feel smarter than me. Each time he corrected me, expanded, explained. You always overthink, he said at one point, laughing. Dad used to say that about you. That one almost broke me. But I let it land, let the silence stretch until he filled it with more words. By the second call, he was openly relaxed. He spoke about the house like it already belonged to him, about the company like it was something he'd rescued from mismanagement. You don't need to worry about any of that anymore, he said. It's handled. Another word he loved. That night I cried in Margot's spare bathroom, my face pressed into a towel so she wouldn't hear. Pretending to be broken hurt in a way the slap hadn't. It scraped against something raw and personal. But when I came back out, Margot didn't say a word. She just handed me a glass of water and squeezed my hand. Performance isn't surrender, she said. It's leverage. The next morning, I raised the stakes. I keep thinking about something Dad said I told my stepbrother on the phone, my voice hesitant, about an account I didn't know about, something he set aside years ago. There it was. The hook. What account, he asked too quickly. I don't know, I said. He mentioned it once, then said it didn't matter anymore. But what if it does? What if it's still out there? I could practically hear the calculations racing through his head. How much, he asked. I'm not sure, I replied. Maybe enough to start over. I don't want to miss anything I might need. He cleared his throat. We can look into it, together, but we need to settle things officially first. Of course, I said. I just don't want any surprises. He laughed. Trust me, there won't be. When I hung up, Margot's eyes were bright. He's hooked, she said. Now he'll want witnesses. He'll want everything neat and final. As if on cue, the next message confirmed it. He wanted to meet. In person. At a location he chose. Papers ready. A notary present. Clean. Legal. Final. He wants to close the story, Margot said. That's when people confess without realizing it. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Not from fear this time, but from the effort of holding myself together. I replayed my father's handwriting in my mind, the careful notes, the small question marks, the trust he'd placed in me without ever saying it out loud. In the morning, Margot helped me get dressed. Not like a victim, not like a warrior, like someone who wanted this over with. He's going to push, she said as she adjusted my collar. Let him. What if he gets angry? I asked. He already is, she replied. Anger is just the mask coming off. As we stood by the door ready to leave, I felt strangely calm. He thought I was surrendering. He thought he'd broken me down to something manageable. What he didn't realize was that I was giving him exactly what he wanted. Space, room to talk, room to explain, room to reveal the truth he was so sure no one would ever hear. He believed this meeting would end the problem. I knew it was where everything finally began to fall apart. The building still smelled like him. The moment I stepped inside, the familiar mix of old wood dust and faint coffee hit me so hard I had to pause. My stepbrother walked ahead of me like he owned the place now, keys jangling in his hand, shoulders loose with confidence. He didn't notice the way my breath caught, or maybe he did, and he enjoyed it. "Conference room's free," he said over his shoulder. Figured it was cleaner than Dad's office. Cleaner, as if that was the problem. The conference room sat at the end of the hall glass walls, on three sides, long table polished to a dull shine. The company logo hung crooked on one wall, a detail my father would have fixed immediately. Seeing it like that felt like a small insult, layered onto a larger one. Two people were already inside. One was the notary, a man with a nervous smile and slicked-back hair tapping a pen against his clipboard. The other was my stepmother, seated comfortably at the table, a folder already open in front of her. She looked up and smiled. "There you are, sweetheart. I was worried you wouldn't come." I forced a weak smile in return. "I said I would." My stepbrother gestured to a chair. "Sit. Let's get this done." I sat. The glass walls made me feel exposed, like everything happening inside was on display, even if no one was watching. I could see employees moving in the distance, heads down, pretending not to look. I wondered how many of them knew, how many suspected something was wrong but didn't know where to place the feeling. The notary cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I need to confirm identities." He went through the motions, voice slightly shaky. I answered when prompted, keeping my eyes down, playing my part. My stepbrother leaned back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head, relaxed. "This is straightforward," he said once the formalities were done. "You sign, we transfer the agreed amount, and you walk away." "And the house?" I asked quietly. He sighed, exaggerated patience. "We've been over this. The house stays with us. And the company," I pressed. He smirked. "That's already taken care of." My stepmother glanced at him sharply, then back at me. "We don't need to discuss operational details," she said. "This is about closure." Closure. The word sounded hollow. I picked up the pen but didn't sign. "I just need to understand what I'm giving up," I said. "Dad always said never to sign what you don't understand." My stepbrother laughed. He said a lot of things. I looked up at him then. Did he? The smile on his face flickered just slightly. I flipped through the pages slowly, even though I already knew what they said. Margot's voice echoed in my head. "Let him talk. Let him correct you." "So this clause here," I said, pointing, "it says I waive any future claims related to mismanagement." "That's boilerplate," he said quickly. "Standard language. But why would that be necessary if everything's been handled properly?" I asked, keeping my tone unsure. My stepmother stiffened. "You're overthinking again." "Maybe," I said. "But I just want to be sure." My stepbrother leaned forward, irritation creeping into his voice. "There's nothing to be sure about. The company was bleeding before I stepped in. I stabilized it." "By selling it?" I asked softly. He froze. What he said? "You said it was taken care of," I continued. "That usually means sold." He scoffed. "It's none of your concern." "But it was Dad's life," I said, my voice cracking just enough to sound real. "Did you sell it for less than it was worth?" He slammed his hand on the table. "Enough!" The notary flinched. My stepmother leaned in, voice sharp. "This is exactly why we needed this resolved. You're emotional. You're looking for reasons to drag this out." I nodded, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset anyone." My stepbrother exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look," he said, forcing calm back into his tone. "Yes, the company's being sold. That was always the plan. Always," I asked. "Since Dad started declining," he said, "he couldn't manage it anymore." "That's not what he told me," I said, before I could stop myself. The room went very still. My stepbrother's eyes narrowed. "What did he tell you that he was worried?" I said. "About the numbers. About things not lining up." My stepmother's smile vanished. "He was confused near the end," she said quickly. "You know that." "He wasn't confused," I said, lifting my eyes to meet hers. "He was methodical." My stepbrother stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "This is pointless," he snapped. "We're done playing games." He turned back to me. "You want honesty? Fine. I sold it because it was the smartest move. We got a clean offer. Cash. No delays. How much?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just for a beat." "Enough. Enough compared to what I pressed." My stepmother stood too, placing a hand on his arm. "We don't need to justify ourselves." But it was too late. $3 million, he said, irritation bleeding through. "That's what we got. And that's generous given the state it was in." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face neutral. Margot had been right. The real value was much higher. "That seems low," I said quietly. He laughed, sharp and humorless. "You think you know better than me now. I think Dad would have waited," I said. "He believed in the long term. Dad was sentimental." He snapped. "That's what got him in trouble." "In trouble how?" I asked. My stepbrother stopped pacing. His jaw tightened. My stepmother shot me a warning look. "Sign the papers." I looked down at the pen in my hand, then back up at them. I just need one thing first. What he demanded. Reassurance, I said, that I'm not being cut out because I asked questions. He stared at me, then laughed again, louder this time. You're being cut out because you're a liability. The word hit harder than any slap. A liability, I repeated. Yes, he said. You don't understand business. You don't understand timing. You don't understand what it takes to protect what's ours. Ours, I said softly. Yes, he replied. Mine. There it was. The room felt suddenly smaller, the glass walls pressing in. I could feel my heart pounding, but I forced myself to stay seated, to stay small. I just want to start over, I said. That's all. He waved a dismissive hand, then sign. I picked up the pen again, my fingers shaking. I let it hover over the page, then paused. One last question, I said. He groaned. What now? If I sign this, I asked, I can't ever come back and challenge how things were handled. Right, correct, he said. That's the point. Even if something comes out later, I pressed. Something that shows mistakes were made. He smiled then. Not the polished one. The real one. Nothing's coming out. The confidence in his voice settled like ice in my veins. I lowered the pen, letting it rest on the paper without touching it. Okay, I said quietly. And in that moment, as his shoulders relaxed and his gaze drifted away from me, I knew we had everything we needed. He thought this meeting was the end. He had no idea it was the moment he'd just talked himself into losing everything. The door opened before I had a chance to knock. My stepbrother stood there with a satisfied grin, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up like the day was already behind him. Right on time, he said. I was starting to think you'd changed your mind again. I said I'd be here, I replied. He stepped aside and let me in. The office was louder than the conference room had been. Phones rang, printers hummed. People moved with the nervous energy of a place that knew something was about to change. My father's name was still on the door, but his presence felt thinner now, like a memory everyone was rushing past. You remember Vincent, my stepbrother said, gesturing toward the notary from yesterday. Vincent gave me a quick nod, eyes darting toward the door like he was already planning his exit. And this is just a formality, my stepmother added, her smile smooth and practiced. She held a bottle of champagne at her side, already chilled. Once we're done, we can all finally move forward. Move forward. Another ending disguised as generosity. I took my seat without speaking. The papers were already laid out, neatly stacked tabs, marking where my signature would go. My stepbrother tapped one of them with the same finger he'd used to point at eviction notices and deadlines. Sign here, here, and here, he said. Then you get your transfer, and this nightmare ends. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight. For a moment the room seemed to recede, sounds dulling as my pulse filled my ears. I thought of Margot's kitchen table, of my father's handwriting, of the glove on the porch. I just want to understand something I said, keeping my eyes on the page. My stepbrother sighed dramatically. We did this yesterday. I know I said, but I couldn't sleep. He smirked. That's regret talking. No, I said softly. That's clarity. His smile tightened. Ask your question. You said yesterday nothing would ever come out, I began. That everything was handled. It is, he snapped. But if it wasn't, I continued, lifting my eyes to meet his. This document protects you, not me. Vincent shifted uncomfortably. My stepmother cleared her throat. This is unnecessary. I just want reassurance, I said, that I'm not walking away from something that was taken. My stepbrother leaned forward, voice low. You're walking away from chaos, from a business that was collapsing, from responsibility you never wanted. That's not true, I said. He laughed. You think sitting with Margot and playing detective makes you qualified? The contempt in his voice burned, but I stayed still. I think Dad trusted me, I said, and that scares you. The room went quiet. My stepmother recovered first. Enough, she said sharply. Sign the papers. I didn't move. My stepbrother slammed his hand on the table. You're not in control here. I looked at him, then really looked. The confidence, the impatience, the belief that this moment was already over. That's where you're wrong, I said. The door opened. Detective Riley stepped inside, calm and unhurried, followed by 2 officers and a man in a federal jacket. The noise outside the office faded, as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. William Harris Riley said evenly, "We need to speak with you." My stepbrother's face drained of color. "What is this?" he demanded. "You can't just barge in here." Riley held up a folder. "We can with a warrant." My stepmother's champagne bottle slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, glass scattered like ice. Vincent bolted for the door. One of the officers blocked him effortlessly. "Sit," he said. "This is harassment," my stepbrother snapped. "She set this up." Riley didn't look at me. "She didn't need to. We have recordings," she said. "Financial records, statements. Enough to have this conversation downtown." My stepbrother laughed brittle and loud. "You've got nothing." Riley slid a printed email across the table. "You want to read that out loud for us?" His eyes scanned the page. I watched recognition flicker, then panic. "That's taken out of context," he said. "And this?" Riley asked, placing another document on top. "Transaction dates that don't match your claims. Or this recording where you explain how quickly you needed her out of the house." My stepmother backed toward the wall. "This is ridiculous," she said. "He was just trying to protect the estate." Riley turned to her. "We'll talk about your role in this as well. You can't prove anything," she said, her voice shaking now. "We can," Riley replied, "and we will." My stepbrother stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted. "You're ruining everything!" He lunged toward me. This time I didn't flinch. The officers were faster. They pinned him against the desk, his protests echoing uselessly around the room. Papers slid to the floor, signatures never made. Vincent began to cry. As they cuffed my stepbrother, he twisted his head toward me, fury blazing in his eyes. "You think you've won," he spat. "You're nothing without me." Riley straightened. "She's the reason we're here." My stepmother sank into a chair, hands trembling. "I was just helping him," she whispered. "He needed guidance." Riley nodded. "We'll sort that out." They led my stepbrother out past the employees who had gathered silently in the hallway. Some looked shocked. Others looked relieved. No one spoke. When the door finally closed behind them, the office felt hollow. I stood slowly, my body aching but steady. Riley turned to me, then her expression softening just slightly. "You did exactly what we needed," she said. "You let him talk." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me. He always does. Outside, the sky was bright, almost painfully so. I stepped into the light and took my first full breath in what felt like weeks. The papers lay unsigned behind me. The story they'd tried to end had finally turned, and for the first time since the hospital floor pressed cold against my cheek, I knew the truth was no longer something I had to chase. It was already moving toward them. The silence after his arrest felt unreal, not quiet in a peaceful way, but hollow, like the sound had been scooped out of the world and left behind an echo. For days, everything had been noise, threats, deadlines, raised voices. Now there was nothing to react to, and my body didn't know what to do with that. I slept for almost 12 hours the first night. When I woke up, it was late morning. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in Margot's guest room, soft and unhurried. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then memory rushed back in waves. The office, the handcuffs, the look on my stepbrother's face when he realized he wasn't in control anymore. I sat up slowly, half expecting pain or panic to hit me. Instead, there was just a deep, bone-level exhaustion. Margot was already on the phone when I came into the kitchen, her voice low and precise. She covered the receiver when she saw me. "It's your father's lawyer," she said. "He wants to meet today." My stomach tightened. "Is that bad?" "No," she said firmly. "It's overdue." His office was nothing like the sleek spaces my stepbrother preferred. Wood-paneled walls, shelves crowded with old law books, a desk scarred with decades of use. It smelled faintly of dust and coffee, the way serious places often do. The lawyer stood when we entered, his face lined, his eyes sharp. He shook my hand with both of his. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Those 2 words almost broke me. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He explained what would happen next, step by step. The estate would be frozen, Independent audits would be ordered. Nothing could be sold, transferred, or altered until everything was reviewed. They move too fast, he said. That's usually how people get caught. He slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. This is what your father filed privately a few months before he passed. He asked that it only be released if something went wrong. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a revised will, properly dated, properly witnessed, clear, balanced. Exactly what I knew my father would have written. Provisions for employees, safeguards against coercion. A clause that removed my stepbrother entirely if evidence of misconduct surfaced. He was careful, the lawyer said quietly. And he was worried. I pressed my lips together, emotion tightening my throat. Why didn't he tell me? He didn't want to scare you, Margot said gently. And he didn't want them to know he suspected anything. The lawyer nodded. He trusted you to be strong if it came to this. That word again. Trusted. For so long my stepbrother had painted me as fragile, emotional, not built for pressure. But my father had seen something else, something steady. The investigation unfolded faster than I expected. Once one thread was pulled, the rest came loose. Accountants flagged discrepancies that had been buried for years. Emails surfaced that confirmed timelines my stepbrother had sworn were false. People who'd stayed silent before started talking once they realized someone was finally listening. The company employees were called into a meeting a week later. I stood in front of them, heart pounding, feeling completely unqualified and strangely grounded at the same time. I'm not here to make promises, I told them. I'm here to tell the truth. They listened. I explained what I could, what was still being reviewed, what safeguards were being put in place. I told them the company wasn't being sold, that their jobs and pensions were protected while the investigation continued. When I finished, no one clapped. Instead, people stood up one by one and thanked me, not loudly, not emotionally, just honestly. That meant more than applause ever could. The trial itself was brutal. Sitting in that courtroom listening to my stepbrother's voice played back through recordings, hearing his words stripped of charm and context, made my skin crawl. The way he talked about timing, about pressure, about getting me out of the way. He never looked at me when the evidence was read. My stepmother sat rigid beside him, her expression carefully blank. When she testified, she painted herself as supportive, confused, trying to keep the family together. But documents have a way of telling cleaner stories than people do. The judge didn't rush the verdict. When it came, it landed with a finality that felt almost gentle compared to everything that had led up to it. Guilty, on multiple counts, sentencing scheduled, bail denied. My stepbrother turned then finally and looked straight at me. There was no rage in his eyes anymore, no confidence, just disbelief. As if he couldn't understand how someone he'd dismissed for so long could be standing there whole. Life didn't magically reset after that. There were still meetings, still paperwork, still moments when grief hit me sideways, triggered by something small. A smell, a phrase, a habit I'd inherited without realizing it. But the constant tension was gone. I moved into a small apartment near the company offices, a place that felt like a beginning rather than a replacement. I took my time unpacking, deciding what deserved space in my life now. Margot visited often always with a new article or a new observation. People think revenge is loud, she said once sipping tea at my kitchen table. But real justice is boring, and that's how you know it's working. She was right. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter from prison. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I didn't open it. I wrote "Return to sender" on the envelope and dropped it back into the mailbox without a second thought. That was when I knew the hold he'd had on me was truly gone. I stood at my father's grave on a clear autumn morning not long after. Leaves crunched under my shoes. The air smelled clean and sharp. I didn't do it the way he thought I would, I said softly. I didn't disappear. I imagined his smile then, the small, proud one he used when a project held up under stress. I think you'd approve, I added. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from the office. Another audit complete, another system stabilized, another quiet win. I walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd defeated someone, but because I'd finally stepped fully into the space I'd been told wasn't mine, and I wasn't giving it back. The first morning I woke up without bracing myself for bad news, I didn't recognize the feeling right away. There was no rush of panic, no instinctive scan of my phone for missed calls or threats. Just quiet, real quiet. The kind that settles instead of suffocates. Sunlight came through the window of my apartment and landed on the floor in a way that felt almost intentional, like the day was waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I lay there longer than usual, listening to my own breathing, testing the stillness. My ribs still ached when I shifted. Healing doesn't erase pain overnight, but the ache no longer carried fear with it. It was just a body remembering what it had been through. I made coffee and drank it slowly at the small kitchen table I'd bought secondhand. Nothing in that room had a story tied to him, or her, or the house that had stopped being mine before I was ready to let it go. This space was chosen, not inherited, earned, not taken. That mattered more than I expected. Later that morning I walked to the office. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The building looked the same from the outside, but inside the air felt different, lighter. Conversations happened in full voices again instead of whispers. People made eye contact. They smiled. I passed the conference room where everything had unraveled and didn't stop. I didn't need to. That chapter was finished. At my desk, I opened a drawer and found something I'd put there weeks earlier and almost forgotten about. My father's notebook, the one that had started everything. I ran my fingers over the worn leather cover and felt a strange gratitude settle in my chest. He hadn't protected me by shielding me from the truth. He'd protected me by trusting me to handle it. The company meeting that afternoon was brief. Updates, confirmations, plans that stretched forward instead of circling the past. When it ended, people lingered, not because they were unsure, but because no one felt rushed to escape anymore. Margot stopped by later, as she often did, carrying a folder under one arm and that familiar sharp look in her eye. "Final audit came back clean," she said. "You're officially boring." I smiled. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You look different. I feel different," I said. And it was true. Not triumphant, not hardened, just solid. That evening I went home and cooked dinner for myself. Nothing fancy. Pasta, bread, the kind of meal my father would have approved of because it didn't pretend to be more than it was. As I ate, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head anymore. I wasn't rehearsing arguments that would never happen. I wasn't waiting for someone to knock on the door and demand something I couldn't give. The noise that had lived in my thoughts for so long had finally gone quiet. There were things I didn't get back. The house. Certain objects that disappeared before I knew to protect them. Pieces of a childhood that would always feel incomplete now. Justice doesn't reverse time. It just stops it from being stolen again. And that was enough. A week later, I received notice that the last appeal had been denied. I read it once, folded the paper, and put it in a drawer I rarely opened, not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't need to remember every day. I'd already learned what I needed from it. I went to the park that afternoon, the one my father used to walk through when he needed to think. I sat on a bench and watched people pass. Couples, parents, strangers carrying their own invisible stories. For the first time, I didn't feel set apart from them by what I'd survived. Pain doesn't make you special, but surviving it can make you honest. I thought back to the hospital, the cold floor, the shock of being hit in a place where I'd expected care. That moment had felt like the end of everything I understood about family safety and my own worth. But it wasn't the end. It was the line I finally stopped stepping back from. If there's one thing this taught me, it's that pressure reveals more than it creates. People don't become cruel in moments like that. They reveal the cruelty that was already there. And people don't become strong overnight either. They discover the strength that's been waiting for permission. I didn't win because I yelled louder. I won because I didn't rush, because I paid attention, because I said no once and meant it even when it cost me everything I thought I needed. And if you're listening to this, thinking about a moment in your own life when someone tried to corner you, tried to hurry you into giving up something that mattered, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not wrong for needing time. You're not weak for saying no. And you're not broken just because someone else decided to treat you like an obstacle instead of a person. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about a boundary you wish you'd held or one you're learning to set, now I'd really like to hear from you. Share it in the comments. Not for drama, for connection. And if you want to keep listening to stories about quiet strength, about justice that doesn't shout, and about people reclaiming what they were told didn't belong to them, stay with me here. Subscribe, come back, and let's keep telling the kinds of stories that remind us who we are when everything else falls away. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't payback. It's walking forward without carrying them with you.